A stranger in the sunlight. The afternoon sun cast a warm, golden hue over the small gas station on the edge of town, stretching shadows across the worn concrete. Sheriff Tom Anderson pulled his patrol car up to one of the pumps, a ritual he performed countless times on his daily rounds. He knew this station like the back of his hand. The old pumps, the creak of the rusted sign above the door, the way the late-day sun turned everything a shade of amber. But today, something was different. Something gnawed at the edges of his instincts, a sense he couldn't quite shake. Across from him, a white pickup truck sat parked by another pump. A man in his late 30s, wearing a faded t-shirt and dusty jeans, was at the driver's side, seemingly engrossed in the task of filling up his truck. The figure standing by the passenger side, however, immediately drew Tom's attention. A young black girl, probably around 10 years old, small for her age. Her posture was tense, her shoulders slightly hunched, and she kept shifting from foot to foot, her gaze darting around the station. It wasn't the behavior of a carefree child on a road trip with her dad. Tom had spent 20 years on the force, and over time, he'd developed an eye for things that didn't sit right. From the way the girl's pristine white sneakers contrasted with her cautious, almost fearful body language, he sensed something was off. His gaze lingered, watching her more closely, trying to pick up on details that might confirm his suspicions. The sheriff prided himself on his instincts, and right now, they were ringing. The man, Jack, as Tom would later learn, finished pumping gas and walked towards the girl, his posture casual, almost too casual. As he moved closer, the girl stiffened. Her eyes seemed to find Tom's through some silent instinct, her gaze locking onto him. It was then that she did something unexpected. Her small hands moved in a sequence. 3 short gestures, followed by 3 longer ones, then 3 short again. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to someone who had seen it before. She was signaling SOS. Tom's heart rate picked up, but he kept his face neutral. Years on the force had taught him the importance of a calm demeanor, especially when the stakes were high. He looked at the girl's face, her expression a blend of fear and desperation that, once noticed, was hard to ignore. "Everything all right over there?" He called out casually, keeping his voice light and friendly. He took a step forward, watching as the girl's eyes widened. She was afraid, but her gaze held steady, as if imploring him to understand without saying a word. The man, Jack, as he would later introduce himself, turned, his face immediately hardening when he saw Tom approaching. There was something in his posture that radiated a subtle defensiveness, like a cornered animal deciding whether to flee or fight. Tom held his gaze, exuding the authority he'd spent years honing, and waited for the man to speak. "Afternoon, Sheriff," the man said, his voice a tad too measured, the edges of his smile thin and forced. Tom's smile didn't reach his eyes. He didn't look away from Jack, but was keenly aware of the girl's every move beside the man. "Afternoon," Tom replied, his tone even. "Beautiful day for a drive, isn't it?" Jack shrugged, his shoulders tense. "Suppose so," he said, his voice carrying a hint of irritation, as though Tom's presence was an inconvenience rather than a chance encounter. "We're just passing through, Sheriff. Is there a problem?" "Not at all," Tom replied, keeping his tone as friendly as possible. He crouched down, getting to the girl's eye level in a gentle, unthreatening manner. Her eyes darted back to him, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a glimmer of hope flicker there. "Hey there, I'm Sheriff Anderson," he said quietly. "But you can just call me Tom. Folks around here usually do." The girl's lips parted slightly, her hands trembling as she reached into her pocket. Her fingers emerged clutching a small folded piece of paper. In a swift motion, barely noticeable, she pressed the paper into his hand, her fingers lingering for just a second before she let go. The sheriff's eyes flicked down briefly as he took the paper, the action so discreet that anyone not watching closely would have missed it entirely. Before Tom could look at the note, the gas pump clicked, signaling that the tank was full. Jack turned and took a step towards them, his gaze narrowing as he caught sight of Tom crouched next to the girl. His expression darkened, a flicker of something sharp crossing his face. "Is there a reason you're talking to my daughter, Sheriff?" Jack asked, his voice edged with a challenge. The tone was enough to set Tom's internal alarms ringing louder. He couldn't afford to let Jack see his suspicions, though. Not yet. Tom rose slowly, slipping the note into his uniform pocket without a hint of what he was thinking. He met Jack's gaze, keeping his own calm and disarming. "Just making sure everyone's all right," he replied, his tone light, but his eyes keen. "I like to get to know folks passing through. Small town and all that." Jack's jaw clenched, but he forced a stiff smile. "Well, we're all right," he said, the defensiveness in his voice hardening into something else. Something that told Tom this was a man used to control and didn't like when things went sideways. "Aren't we, sweetheart?" The girl nodded, her eyes cast down, her small voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir." But Tom noticed the way her fingers trembled at her sides, and he didn't miss the slight wince that crossed her face when Jack's hand landed on her shoulder. "Good to hear," Tom said, his voice steady but his mind racing. He couldn't just let them drive off, not after what he'd seen. The girl's silent plea for help, the tension in her posture, and now the paper in his pocket, all of it pointed to something darker simmering below the surface. As he watched the pair climb back into the pickup truck, Tom felt the weight of the note pressing against his chest. He waited until they were out of earshot, his gaze following the truck as it pulled out of the station and headed down the dusty road. Only then did he pull the small paper from his pocket and unfold it, his pulse thrumming with anticipation. The handwriting was tiny, as if the writer had tried to conserve as much space as possible. The message was brief but devastating in its implications. "Help me. He isn't my dad." A chill ran down Tom's spine as he reread the words, the weight of the situation crashing over him like a wave. The girl had signaled for help, handed him this desperate plea, and now she was on the road with a man who was, in all likelihood, dangerous. In his 2 decades of service, Tom had seen cases of every kind, but this was different. This was urgent, and the stakes were impossibly high. Tom took a deep breath, his mind racing as he planned his next move. He couldn't ignore this. His duty demanded action. He climbed back into his patrol car, radioing his deputy as he pulled out of the station. "Jimmy, this is Tom. I've got a situation here. Need a trace on a white pickup heading northbound on Route 16. We may have a possible abduction case." The radio crackled with his deputy's voice. "Got it, Sheriff. Want me to set up a roadblock?" "Negative. Let's keep this quiet. I don't want him spooked. Just keep a safe distance, and I'll catch up." As Tom sped down the road, he gripped the steering wheel tighter. He knew he had to act swiftly and carefully. This wasn't just about protecting a young girl. It was about ensuring she made it to safety without a single moment of further harm. And he intended to make sure of that, no matter the cost. A race against time. Sheriff Tom Anderson kept his eyes trained on the horizon as he sped down Route 16. The golden afternoon sun had shifted lower, casting long shadows across the 2-lane road that stretched into the distance. Every second felt like an eternity, his heartbeat pounding in sync with the hum of his patrol car's engine. The note was still in his pocket, its weight like a silent reminder of the responsibility he now bore. There was no room for mistakes. The message, "Help me. He isn't my dad," played on a loop in his mind, each word driving him forward. Tom didn't know the girl's name or her story, but he knew enough. She needed help, and she had placed her trust in him, however small or desperate that trust may have been. "Jimmy," he said into his radio, keeping his voice steady. "Any sign of the white pickup yet?" A crackle of static followed, then Deputy Jimmy's voice, calm and reassuring. "Yeah, Sheriff. Just spotted it about a mile ahead, keeping my distance. He's sticking to the speed limit, not a sign of anything unusual." Tom nodded, even though Jimmy couldn't see him. He knew Jack would be cautious. People who hid dark secrets often wore them with a kind of paranoid vigilance, careful not to attract attention. Jack might not have known that the girl had signaled Tom or that she'd slipped him a note, but anyone as wary as Jack would be on high alert, especially with a police cruiser nearby. "Good," Tom replied, maintaining his speed. "Keep following him, but don't get too close. I'm about 2 minutes behind you." As the patrol car zoomed down the narrow road, Tom's mind sifted through the details. He could sense the girl's fear as vividly as if she were still standing beside him. The slight wince when Jack touched her shoulder, the way her hands trembled as she passed him the note. It all painted a picture of a child trapped in a dangerous situation. But who was Jack, really? And what was he doing with this girl? Tom quickly ran through scenarios. Abduction was the most obvious, but there could be more layers to it. Was Jack someone she knew, or had he taken her by force? What lengths would he go to if he realized she tried to get help? Tom had seen firsthand how predators operated, the lengths they would go to maintain control. But as much as he tried to anticipate Jack's moves, there were still too many unknowns. Up ahead, Jimmy's cruiser came into view, keeping a steady but cautious pace as it tailed the white pickup truck. Tom eased off the accelerator slightly, keeping enough distance to avoid alarming Jack. His mind raced with his next steps. An immediate confrontation could backfire. If Jack sensed the sheriff was onto him, there was no telling what he'd do. He might speed off, try to evade arrest, or worse, hurt the girl in a desperate attempt to escape. Tom's voice was quiet but firm when he spoke into the radio again. "Jimmy, we need to stay out of sight. There's an old rest area up ahead, around mile marker 52. If we're lucky, Jack might pull in. He's been on the road a while now, and it's a natural place to stop." Jimmy's voice came back immediately. "Got it, Sheriff. I'll keep my distance and see if he takes the bait." As they drove on, a plan started forming in Tom's mind. He'd learned over the years that sometimes patience was the best weapon. It allowed him to assess a situation from every angle, to anticipate the twists and turns that inevitably came with dangerous cases. In a situation like this, a measured approach could make all the difference between saving a life and putting one in danger. A few minutes later, the rest area came into view. It was little more than a gravel patch with a couple of picnic tables and a lone restroom building. But it was enough. Tom held his breath, watching as the white pickup signaled and veered off the main road, pulling into the rest area. "Jackpot," Tom muttered under his breath. He motioned for Jimmy to stop further down the road to avoid drawing attention. He'd approach on foot, keeping out of sight until he could assess the situation. Parking his patrol car about 50 yards down the road, Tom slipped out quietly, his movements as silent as his breath. The air was thick with the scent of pine and dry grass, and the only sounds were the faint chirping of crickets and the low hum of the wind rustling the trees. He approached the rest area slowly, keeping low and staying within the shadows. From his vantage point behind a tree, he could see Jack pacing by the truck, glancing around as though looking for something or someone. The girl was still in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed downward, her small form almost motionless. The sight stirred something fierce in Tom. She was so still, as if she'd learned to disappear in plain sight. Tom's radio crackled softly in his pocket. He reached in and turned the volume down, then whispered, "Jimmy, you there?" "Yeah, Sheriff." Jimmy's voice came back, barely audible. "What's the plan?" "Stay put for now. I'm going to get closer, try to make contact without spooking him. I want to talk to the girl without him overhearing if possible. I'll signal you if things go sideways." "Understood," Jimmy replied. Tom knew his deputy was solid, calm under pressure, and ready to back him up in a heartbeat. Tom inched closer, staying behind a line of thick shrubs until he was just a few feet from the truck. The girl's gaze lifted, and for a brief moment, her eyes met his. There was a flicker of recognition, and he saw her hand move slightly in her lap, forming that same SOS pattern she'd used at the gas station. She was desperate, but also brave. Brave enough to try to communicate with him again, despite the danger of getting caught. Tom took a slow breath, then stepped out from behind the shrub, moving around the truck so that he was in her line of sight, but shielded from Jack. He offered her a gentle nod, a silent reassurance that he was there for her, that he hadn't abandoned her plea for help. He placed his finger to his lips, signaling for her to stay quiet. Her eyes widened, but she nodded subtly, her hand still in her lap. Just as he was about to step away, Jack's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Hey," Jack shouted, his voice laced with suspicion. "What are you doing sneaking around my truck, Sheriff?" Tom turned, his expression a mask of calm. "Just stretching my legs, Jack. Nothing wrong with that, is there?" He kept his tone light, nonchalant, as though he hadn't a care in the world. Jack's gaze darted between Tom and the girl, his posture tense. "Stretching your legs, huh? Well, it looks to me like you're sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Tom held his gaze, unblinking. "Part of my job to look out for folks, especially when they're passing through our town." Jack's jaw tightened. For a moment, it looked as if he might lash out, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. But then he forced a stiff smile, trying to mask his irritation. "Well, we're just fine, Sheriff. No need to worry about us." The tension hung thick in the air, a silent standoff that neither of them dared to break. Tom could feel the girl's eyes on him, a silent plea for protection that resonated deep within him. He couldn't walk away, not now. But he had to play this right, or the entire situation could spiral out of control. "Glad to hear it," Tom said slowly, his voice steady. "I was just about to head back anyway. But if you need anything, I'll be around." He turned, taking a few steps toward his patrol car, but he kept his gaze trained on Jack out of the corner of his eye. The girl's face remained impassive, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her eyes followed Tom's every move. In that brief moment, he saw a glimmer of understanding pass between them, a shared recognition of the danger that lingered between them and Jack. As he reached his patrol car, Tom stole a glance back at the rest area. Jack was watching him, his stance rigid, his expression wary. Tom forced himself to stay calm, maintaining the facade of an officer simply minding his own business. But his mind was racing. He'd made contact, established a line of trust with the girl. But that was only the beginning. Tom knew he couldn't stop now. He had to act, and soon, before Jack took her farther away, perhaps to a place where help wouldn't be as close. As he slipped into his patrol car, Tom formulated his next steps, determined to save the girl from whatever nightmare she was living. And he knew he wouldn't rest until she was safely out of harm's reach. Into the darkness, Sheriff Tom Anderson sat in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel as he watched Jack pace around the truck. The shadows were beginning to stretch as evening approached, casting an ominous glow over the rest area. Tom's instincts screamed at him that time was running out. The girl's signal had been a silent cry for help, and the fear in her eyes had been all too real. He couldn't let her slip away. Tom glanced in the rearview mirror and spotted Deputy Jimmy parked farther down the road, awaiting instructions. They'd worked together for years, and Jimmy was as dependable as they came. But even Jimmy couldn't predict how volatile a situation like this might become. Every step Tom took had to be calculated, planned with the utmost care. After another brief look at Jack, Tom keyed his radio, his voice a barely audible whisper. "Jimmy, I think it's time we step this up. I'm going to approach again. See if I can get Jack talking. Try to catch him off guard. Be ready if things get heated." "Roger that, Sheriff," Jimmy replied, his voice tense but resolute. Tom steeled himself, taking one last calming breath before stepping out of the car. As he made his way back toward the rest area, he forced a relaxed gait, careful to seem nonchalant. Jack turned as he approached, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. The man's hands were jammed into his pockets, his entire body radiating a defensive energy that made Tom's senses sharpen even further. "Evening again," Tom said, giving Jack a nod. He kept his expression friendly, but kept a closer eye on Jack's every movement. "I couldn't help but notice you've been on the road for a while. Thought I'd come back and see if you needed directions. It's easy to get turned around on these roads." Jack's smile was forced, a thin line that never reached his eyes. "We're fine, Sheriff. Just stopping to stretch our legs, like you said. Been a long drive, and we've still got a ways to go." Tom nodded, his gaze drifting to the girl in the truck. She was sitting perfectly still, her gaze locked on her lap, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked small, dwarfed by the size of the passenger seat. There was a fragile strength to her, a quiet resilience that reminded him of his own daughter at that age. But she was still just a child, and the idea that she was in danger here fueled a quiet fury within him. "Mind if I chat with her a minute?" Tom asked, his voice as casual as he could make it. Sometimes kids like to tell you their own version of a road trip story. Makes the job a little more interesting, you know. Jack's body language shifted slightly, his fingers clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I don't see why that's necessary," he said, a slight edge creeping into his voice. "She's my daughter, and she's just fine." "Sure, I understand that," Tom replied, meeting Jack's gaze with an unyielding calm. "But like I said, it's my job to check in on folks passing through. We get all kinds of people out here, and I like to make sure everyone's comfortable and safe." Jack's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, Tom saw something dark flash in his eyes. Something angry, something dangerous. But Jack forced another stiff smile, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "Look, Sheriff, we're just trying to mind our own business here. It's been a long trip, and we're both tired. I'd appreciate it if you let us get back on the road." Tom held Jack's gaze, unflinching. "I get that, Jack, but I'm afraid I'm not quite ready to let you go just yet. Something doesn't sit right with me, and in my line of work, that means I have to follow up." The silence between them was thick, every second stretching longer than the last. Jack's eyes flicked to the girl in the truck, and Tom could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was calculating, weighing his options, likely trying to figure out how much Tom knew or suspected. At that moment, the girl's face turned toward the sheriff, her expression masked with a calm that seemed beyond her years. But Tom could see the tension in her eyes, the silent plea hidden beneath her quiet gaze. "Sweetheart," he called to her gently, careful not to startle her. "Mind if I ask you a quick question?" The girl's eyes darted to Jack before nodding slightly. She looked back at Tom, and he saw something in her face, a sliver of hope mingled with fear. He took a step closer to the truck, angling himself so that he was closer to her, subtly placing himself between her and Jack. "What's your name?" Tom asked softly, keeping his tone kind and patient. He needed her to feel safe, even if only for a few seconds. She hesitated, her lips parting slightly as she looked up at him. "My name is Layla," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her gaze shifted back to Jack, as if she expected some kind of punishment just for speaking. "Layla," Tom repeated gently. "That's a beautiful name." He noticed Jack's hand clenching into a fist at his side, but he kept his focus on the girl. "How old are you, Layla?" 10, she replied, her voice even softer. Tom nodded, his heart aching at the fragility in her voice. "You from around here, Layla?" The girl's gaze dropped, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "No, sir," she whispered, barely audible. Her hands gripped the fabric of her dress, her knuckles turning white. Jack stepped forward, his voice filled with irritation. "Sheriff, enough with the questions. We're just passing through. There's no need for an interrogation here." Tom turned to face Jack, his expression hardening. "Jack, let me be clear about something. I'm here because I have reason to believe something's wrong. Now, I don't want any trouble, but I also won't stand by if there's a chance someone's in danger." Jack's face twisted, and for the first time, Tom saw the mask slip. Beneath the forced smiles and stiff politeness, there was a cold, simmering anger. his fists clenched, his posture tensed, and Tom could see the calculation in his eyes, the kind that came when someone was weighing their options. "You think I'm some kind of criminal?" Jack's voice was low, his words filled with barely restrained rage. "She's my daughter, my flesh and blood. You have no right. If she's your daughter, you'd want her to be safe, right?" Tom interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "You'd want her to feel comfortable, to know she can trust me to help if she needs it." Jack's jaw tightened, his gaze darting to Layla, who sat motionless in the truck. Her eyes met Tom's once more, and he saw a flicker of desperation in them. She was trapped, caught between the man beside her and the hope of rescue. But he could also see her resilience, her courage to reach out despite the danger. Tom took a step back, his eyes never leaving Jack. "I think it's best if you and I have a talk away from the truck," he said evenly. "Let's give Layla a minute to herself. No harm in that, right?" Jack's nostrils flared, and for a brief moment, Tom thought he might lash out. But then Jack took a step back, his shoulders tense as he forced a smile. "Fine," he spat, his voice dripping with barely concealed resentment. "Let's talk." Tom led Jack a few paces away from the truck, his stance relaxed but ready for any sudden movement. They stopped near the edge of the rest area, just out of earshot of the girl, but close enough that Tom could keep an eye on her. "You've got quite the protective streak, don't you, Sheriff?" Jack said, his voice low, laced with venom. "Sticking your nose in where it doesn't belong." "Comes with the badge," Tom replied calmly. "I don't like to see people hurting, especially kids." Jack scoffed, crossing his arms. "You think you know everything, don't you? You've known us for what? 5 minutes. And suddenly, you're the expert on my family." Tom's gaze remained steady, unblinking. "You're right. I don't know your family. I don't know your story. But I do know one thing. That girl asked me for help, and I intend to make sure she's safe." Jack's eyes hardened, his fists clenching at his sides. He took a step forward, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. "You think you can just take her? Think again, Sheriff. She's mine, and I don't care what you think you know. You don't have the right." Tom felt his own pulse quicken, his muscles tensing. He'd dealt with men like Jack before, men who saw others as possessions, who used fear to control. But he also knew that confronting him directly wouldn't work. He needed a way to de-escalate the situation without putting Layla at further risk. "Jack," Tom said, his voice calm but unyielding, "you don't want to make this harder on yourself. I get the feeling you're not being honest with me, and if that's the case, things will only get worse." Jack's expression twisted with a mixture of anger and frustration. But before he could respond, a small voice called out from the truck, breaking the tension. "Sheriff." Layla's voice was soft but steady. Can I talk to you for a minute?" Tom looked over at her, feeling a surge of respect for her courage. He turned back to Jack, his gaze firm. "You heard her. She wants to talk to me." Jack opened his mouth to argue, but something in Tom's expression stopped him. His shoulders slumped slightly, a defeated, almost resigned look crossing his face. "Fine," Jack muttered through gritted teeth, stepping back. "But make it quick." Tom nodded and walked back to the truck, crouching down to meet Layla's gaze. "Layla, you wanted to talk." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, don't let him take me." The cry for freedom. Tom felt a pang deep in his chest at the girl's quiet plea. "Please, don't let him take me." Those 6 words, spoken so softly yet filled with such a palpable sense of dread, tore through him. Layla was holding back tears, her hands twisting the hem of her dress, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, something that looked like relief. She had spoken the words, made her desperate wish known, and now the rest was in his hands. Tom crouched by the open passenger door, keeping his gaze steady and calm as he nodded to her. "Layla, I'm here for you. he said gently. "But I need you to trust me and answer a few questions, all right? Are you in danger with him?" Layla's gaze darted to where Jack stood, leaning against the side of the truck, watching them like a hawk. Her voice was barely a whisper as she replied, "Yes, Sheriff. I don't want to go with him anymore. I don't even know him." Her words confirmed Tom's worst fears. She was with a stranger, someone who had likely taken her far from her home and any semblance of safety. His mind ran through the possibilities of who Jack might be: a kidnapper, a trafficker, or perhaps someone with even darker intentions. But whatever the case, he now had a moral duty and a legal obligation to protect her. Tom took a steadying breath, carefully choosing his next words. "All right, Layla. I'm not going to let you go with him. But I need you to stay calm and stay here while I talk to him. Can you do that?" Layla nodded, her eyes wide, clinging to his words as if they were a lifeline. Tom gave her a reassuring smile, standing up and closing the passenger door carefully. Then he turned to face Jack, who had been watching their interaction with barely concealed frustration. "Jack, I think we need to have a real talk now," Tom said, keeping his voice calm but authoritative. "Step over here with me. Let's clear a few things up." Jack's posture shifted slightly, a muscle ticking in his jaw. He glanced at Layla through the car window, and Tom noticed the cold look that flickered across his face before he turned back to the sheriff. "We're just trying to get home, Sheriff," Jack said, his voice a mixture of irritation and forced patience. "She's tired. I'm tired. Why don't you let us go, and we'll be out of your town before you know it?" Tom met Jack's gaze, unwavering. "Jack, I need you to be honest with me. Layla says she doesn't know you. She's scared. Now, if there's an explanation for that, I suggest you give it to me. Otherwise, we're going to have to take this to the station." Jack's face darkened, his expression hardening as he took a step toward Tom, his shoulders tensing. "She's my niece, Sheriff. Her mother, well, let's just say she's not in the picture anymore. And I'm the only family she's got. She's just not used to me yet. That's all." The explanation was weak, but it was also dangerous. If he claimed familial ties, it would complicate things legally, making it harder for Tom to intervene without concrete evidence. But Tom could see through Jack's bluff. This wasn't the first time he'd dealt with someone lying to cover their tracks. The signs were there: the defensive posture, the overly rehearsed tone, the way he'd hesitated before speaking. He knew a fabricated story when he heard one. "Then you won't mind if I confirm that," Tom said, giving Jack a cool, hard stare. "It's standard procedure when a minor might be in trouble." Jack's facade cracked for a moment, his eyes flashing with anger. "You can't do that. You don't have the right to interfere in family business." "I do if that family business endangers a child," Tom replied, keeping his voice steady. "Now you can either cooperate or I'll be forced to call this in officially. We'll get social services involved, and if there's nothing to hide, you'll be free to go soon enough." Jack's hand clenched into a fist, and for a brief moment, Tom braced himself, wondering if he'd try to fight. But then, Jack took a deep breath, his expression calculating as he tried to regain control. "Fine. Go ahead. Call whoever you need to. But you'll be sorry for sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Ignoring the veiled threat, Tom turned to his radio, signaling Jimmy. "Jimmy, we're going to need backup. I want a social services officer on standby and a transport vehicle ready to go. We have a minor who may need protective custody." Jimmy's voice crackled over the radio, filled with determination. "Copy that, Sheriff. I'll get on it." Jack let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he glanced over at Layla, who was watching the exchange from the truck with cautious hope in her eyes. "She'll just tell them the same thing I'm telling you. She's my niece, and we're going home. You're wasting your time." "We'll see about that," Tom replied, keeping his expression neutral. He knew Jack was lying, but he also knew that getting the girl out of immediate danger was his first priority. He wasn't about to let Jack intimidate or manipulate him into backing down. Tom walked back to the truck and opened the passenger door, crouching down to Layla's level. "Layla," he said gently, "do you know anyone we could call? Anyone who can confirm that you're safe or help us figure out what's going on?" Layla's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head slowly. "No, Sheriff. I don't have anyone. My mom is gone, and I don't know where my dad is." Her voice trembled, each word coming out in a near whisper. Tom's heart ached for her. She was completely alone, a child with nowhere to turn, no family she felt safe with. He glanced back at Jack, who was standing by, watching them with an unsettling intensity. He leaned in close, his voice just loud enough for her to hear. "Layla, I want you to know that we're going to get you somewhere safe. You won't have to go with him. But I need you to trust me and stay calm. Can you do that?" She nodded, a hint of relief in her tearful gaze, as if the very act of being heard had lifted some of the weight off her small shoulders. Tom reached out, gently patting her hand. "Good. We're going to get through this together." Just then, Jimmy pulled up with a second patrol car, along with a social worker named Maria who'd worked with the department for years. Maria was calm, steady, the kind of person who had a gift for making people feel at ease. She approached the truck with a soft smile, crouching down beside Tom. "Hi there, Layla," Maria said gently. "My name is Maria, and I'm here to help. I know this might be confusing, but we're here to make sure you're safe. Would it be all right if I talked with you for a little while?" Layla looked to Tom for reassurance, and he gave her an encouraging nod. "It's okay, Layla. Maria's here to help you." Layla glanced at Jack, who was now glaring openly at the scene unfolding in front of him. "But he won't. He won't let me go," she whispered, fear etched into her face. Maria reached out, her hand resting on Layla's. "You don't have to worry about him anymore, sweetie. We're here now, and we're going to make sure you're safe. You won't have to go anywhere you don't want to." The relief on Layla's face was almost heartbreaking. She nodded, her fingers relaxing slightly as she released the fabric of her dress, finally allowing herself to trust these strangers who had come to her rescue. Tom rose, nodding to Maria to continue as he turned his attention back to Jack. "Looks like we're going to be handling things from here, Jack. Why don't you tell me where you're from, so we can verify some details?" Jack's face contorted with anger. He took a step forward, raising his voice. "This is ridiculous. She's my niece. You're going to regret doing this." "Enough," Tom said, his voice sharp. "The best thing you can do now is cooperate. This could be a lot easier for you if you work with us." But Jack's patience had finally run out. His eyes narrowed, and before anyone could react, he lunged forward, reaching for the passenger door. Tom was faster, intercepting him mid-movement, shoving him back with enough force to put distance between him and the truck. "Stand down," Tom commanded, his voice thunderous, filled with authority. Jimmy was at Tom's side in an instant, grabbing Jack's arm and forcing him to the ground. Jack struggled, his voice a snarl as he spat threats. "You don't know who you're messing with. She's mine. You have no right." But Tom ignored him, focusing instead on Jimmy, who quickly secured Jack in handcuffs and led him to the back of the patrol car. Tom took a deep breath, his anger carefully contained as he watched Jack glare at him through the window, his face twisted with hatred. Tom turned back to Layla, who was now out of the truck and standing beside Maria, a mixture of shock and relief evident on her face. He walked over to her, kneeling down again so he could look her in the eye. "It's over, Layla," he said softly. "You're safe now." A single tear traced down her cheek as she nodded. For the first time since he'd met her, she allowed herself a tiny, trembling smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A path to safety. With Jack secured in the back of the patrol car, Sheriff Tom Anderson turned his full attention to Layla. The relief in her eyes was clear, but there was a lingering fear, an uncertainty about what would come next. Tom understood that all too well. After all, Layla had spent who knew how long being controlled and manipulated, likely threatened with consequences if she ever tried to escape. Her newfound freedom was still fragile, tentative. He glanced at Maria, the social worker, who gave him a small nod of understanding. Tom knew Maria well enough to trust her to handle the delicate conversations ahead, to ensure Layla felt safe in ways she hadn't experienced in a long time. Tom knelt down beside her again, keeping his tone as calm as possible. "Layla, you're going to be okay now. You're safe, and Maria is here to help you with whatever you need. She'll answer any questions you might have and make sure you're well taken care of." Layla looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Her eyes darted nervously to the patrol car where Jack sat, his eyes fixed on her through the glass, his expression seething with barely concealed rage. Tom placed himself between her and Jack's line of sight, subtly shielding her from his gaze. Maria crouched down next to Layla, her voice gentle and reassuring. "Layla, would you like to come with me? I have a safe place for you to stay tonight, and there will be people there who care about you and want to help. You won't have to go anywhere near him again, I promise." The girl's gaze flickered between Tom and Maria, and finally, she nodded, a hesitant smile breaking through her fear. Tom felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a sense of relief that she was beginning to trust them. Still, there was something about her guarded expression that told him this wouldn't be an easy transition for her. Tom stood and turned to Jimmy, who was watching the situation unfold with a steady presence that Tom appreciated. "Jimmy, let's get Jack back to the station. We'll need to process him, and I'll make sure to have Child Protective Services meet us there to look over any details with Layla." Jimmy nodded. "I've already called them. Sheriff, they'll be ready when we arrive. Want me to ride with him?" "Yes," Tom replied, his voice edged with a hint of tension. "Make sure he doesn't pull any stunts. He seems the type." As Jimmy took Jack, still handcuffed and furious, to the patrol car, Tom returned his focus to Layla and Maria. He crouched down one last time, looking Layla in the eyes. "Layla, we're going to make sure you're safe and that he can't hurt you anymore. But if there's anything you want to tell me, anything that will help us understand what you've been through, I want you to know I'm here to listen." She hesitated, glancing over at Maria, then back at Tom. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts, and then her quiet voice filled the space between them. I was at home," she began, her voice trembling. "I was with my mom. And then one night, she just didn't come back. I waited and I waited, but..." Her voice broke, and she looked down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Tom reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, Layla. Take your time." She nodded, taking a deep breath, and continued. "After that, he came. I didn't know him, but he said he knew my mom, that he was a friend. I didn't have anyone else to help, so I went with him. But then, he started saying things that scared me. And when I tried to leave, he told me I had to stay, that nobody would help me anyway." Her words painted a stark picture, one Tom had seen far too often in his years of service. Vulnerable children, caught in the worst circumstances, manipulated by adults who knew how to exploit fear and isolation. But Layla, despite everything, had managed to reach out for help. She'd shown bravery that even adults sometimes struggle to muster. Maria took Layla's hand in hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You did the right thing, Layla. You were so brave, and now we can help you. You won't have to go through this alone." Layla looked up, her expression shifting to one of quiet strength. She seemed to be absorbing the words, letting them sink in. Tom could see the wheels turning in her mind, the beginnings of trust forming. "Are you sure?" she asked Maria, her voice small but steady. "Are you sure I'm safe?" Maria nodded with unwavering assurance. "Yes, Layla. You are safe now, and we'll keep you that way." Tom felt a surge of gratitude for Maria's presence. She was handling things with a warmth and empathy that reassured him Layla would have a strong support system going forward. He turned to Maria, his expression earnest. "Let's get her settled. I'll file a full report back at the station. Layla, You're going to be okay." As Maria led Layla toward her car, Tom watched them go, a sense of satisfaction mixed with the heaviness of knowing how close Layla had come to a far worse fate. But she had trusted him, and that trust had made all the difference. He felt a deep sense of duty to honor that trust by making sure she was never put in danger again. Back in his patrol car, Tom took a steadying breath. Jack's scowling face in the rearview mirror was a reminder of the evil that sometimes lurked in plain sight, and of the importance of paying attention to the small signs, the hunches, the silent signals. Layla's SOS gesture, her bravery in handing over that note, had been the lifeline that set her free. As they approached the station, Tom's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen to see a message from Deputy Jimmy. He picked up his radio. "Go ahead, Jimmy." Jimmy's voice came over the radio, serious but calm. "Sheriff, I've been in touch with CPS. They confirmed they'll be able to take Layla into custody temporarily. They also mentioned they're aware of some missing person reports that might match her situation. They're doing a full check now." Tom felt a surge of relief. The possibility that they might be able to reunite Layla with family, real family, was a glimmer of hope. "Good work, Jimmy. Let's make sure we coordinate with them on everything." When they arrived at the station, Maria and Layla were already there, waiting in the lobby. Layla was sitting beside Maria, her posture relaxed for the first time, her face showing the slightest hint of a smile. Seeing her there, safe and hopeful, made Tom feel as though every hard day on the job had been worth it. He approached them, giving Layla a gentle nod. "Layla, we're going to take care of a few things here, but I wanted you to know that CPS will help you find a safe place to stay. They'll work to make sure you have the support you need." Layla's eyes softened, and she looked up at him with a genuine, if tentative, smile. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice sincere. "I didn't think anyone would believe me, but you did." Tom swallowed the lump in his throat, feeling a deep sense of pride for having been able to help her. "That's what I'm here for, Layla. You did everything right. Remember that." Maria led her out, promising that she'd be close by if Layla needed anything, and Tom watched them go, a sense of peace settling over him. He turned to Jimmy, who was standing beside him, watching the scene with a satisfied expression. "You think she'll be okay, Sheriff?" Jimmy asked, a hint of concern in his tone. Tom nodded, confidence in his voice. "She will. She's strong, stronger than most adults I know. And she's got the right people around her now." He paused, watching as Maria's car pulled away, taking Layla to a safe place, far from the nightmares of the past few days. "This job has its rough days, Jimmy, but every so often, we get a day like this. A day where we get to make things right." Jimmy nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Guess that's what keeps us coming back, huh?" Tom smiled, a weary but contented smile. "Yeah, it is." He glanced back at the station, where Jack was being processed and prepared for questioning. "And as for him," he said, nodding toward the holding cells, "we'll make sure he gets what he deserves." The night was falling as Tom returned to his office, the exhaustion of the day settling into his bones. But this was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from knowing he'd done his job well. And as he sat down to file his report, he felt the weight of Layla's story, her courage, and the reminder that even the smallest signals could be cries for help. His mind drifted back to that moment in the gas station, the briefest glance between them, the silent SOS that had set everything into motion. Layla had been brave enough to trust him, and he'd had the honor of being the one to answer her call. The case would take time to resolve fully, and he knew the road ahead would be challenging for Layla as she worked to rebuild her life. But as he sat back and closed his eyes for a moment, he felt a sense of peace. Layla was safe, and that, he knew, was worth everything. A new beginning. The morning sun broke through Tom's office window, casting beams of light across the stacks of paperwork and case files that lined his desk. He rubbed his eyes, weary from the late night he'd spent writing his report on the events with Layla and Jack. Despite the fatigue, there was a quiet satisfaction lingering in him, a sense of accomplishment that outweighed the exhaustion. Layla was safe, and her ordeal was over. A knock at his door pulled Tom from his thoughts. He looked up to see Deputy Jimmy standing in the doorway, holding a file. "Got an update on Layla," Jimmy said, stepping inside. "And you're going to want to hear this." Tom straightened in his chair, motioning for Jimmy to take a seat. "What's the news?" Jimmy handed him the file, his face a mixture of relief and excitement. CPS ran her information through the missing persons database. They found a match. Layla's mother reported her missing almost a year ago, just after she'd been granted full custody. But here's the twist. Layla's mother was deemed unfit by some family members, and that's when Jack took matters into his own hands. Tom's brows knit together in confusion. But Layla mentioned her mother was gone. Did something happen to her? Jimmy shook his head. "No, she's alive and well." It seems Jack convinced Layla that her mother had abandoned her to keep her docile and under control. He knew she was vulnerable, so he fed her lies, used her fear against her. CPS is coordinating with Layla's mother, who's already on her way here to pick her up. Tom let out a slow breath, processing the information. It was a twisted web of manipulation, but it made sense in a grim way. Jack had likely felt he was entitled to rescue Layla from her mother, twisting the situation to suit his own agenda. He'd taken a child in need of stability and protection, and used her vulnerability to secure control. "I'd love to be there when she sees her mom again," Tom murmured, his mind drifting to Layla's face, that flicker of hope he'd seen. She'd been through so much, but now she had a chance at a real home, a real family, a chance to heal. "Well, Sheriff," Jimmy replied with a grin, "we might just get that chance. CPS said they wanted us to be there when they reunited them. Since we're the ones who got her out of there, they figured it'd be a good idea." Tom's face broke into a rare, genuine smile. "Good. She deserves that. And it might help her to see familiar faces." They spent the next hour gathering the necessary files and paperwork for the reunion, double-checking everything they had on Jack to ensure there were no gaps in his charges. Tom wanted nothing more than to see him face the full weight of the law for what he'd put Layla through. As the clock ticked closer to noon, Maria arrived at the station with Layla. The girl looked brighter, calmer than she had the day before. Her hair was braided neatly, her clothes clean, and though she still carried a bit of that haunted look in her eyes, there was also a spark of hope. Tom greeted them with a warm smile. "Hey there, Layla. How are you feeling?" Layla looked up at him, her eyes softening. "Better," she said, her voice stronger than it had been the day before. "Maria told me. My mom is coming. Is that true?" Tom nodded, kneeling down to her level so he could look her in the eye. "Yes, it's true. She's on her way here, and you'll get to see her soon." A mixture of emotions played across her face. Relief, disbelief, even a hint of apprehension. I thought she didn't want me," she whispered, her gaze falling. Tom felt a pang in his chest, realizing just how deeply Jack's lies had affected her. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Layla, your mom's been looking for you this whole time. She never gave up. Jack lied to you to keep you from trying to get help, but none of that was true. She's been waiting to see you again." Tears filled her eyes, and she gave him a small, shaky nod. "Thank you, Sheriff. Thank you for helping me." Tom swallowed hard, his own emotions threatening to surface. "You're welcome, Layla. You're a very brave young lady, you know that." She gave him a tentative smile, wiping her eyes. Just then, Maria stepped in. "Layla, your mother just arrived," she said softly, a warm smile on her face. Layla froze, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Tom could sense her fear, the uncertainty of what to expect after a year of separation, but he also saw the deep yearning in her gaze, the part of her that longed to run straight into her mother's arms. "Would you like me to come with you?" Tom offered, his voice gentle. She nodded, a look of gratitude in her eyes. Tom stood, holding out a hand for her to take. Together, they walked down the hallway to the waiting area where Layla's mother was standing, her eyes red from crying, clutching her hands tightly, as if bracing herself for the moment. Layla's steps slowed as they neared her mother, her grip tightening on Tom's hand. He could feel the tremor in her small fingers and offered a reassuring squeeze. "It's okay," he whispered to her. "She's here for you. She's waited all this time just to see you." Her mother spotted them, and her hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Layla," she whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. "Oh, my baby." Layla's face crumpled, and in a burst of emotion, she released Tom's hand and ran to her mother. She practically leaped into her mother's arms, clinging to her as if afraid she might disappear again. They held each other tightly, the air filled with the sound of quiet sobs, the weight of a year's worth of fear and pain melting away in that one embrace. Tom stepped back, giving them space but keeping a watchful eye on the reunion. The moment was both raw and heartwarming, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of love to heal. After a while, Layla looked over her mother's shoulder and met Tom's gaze, her expression filled with gratitude and something else, perhaps a newfound sense of hope. Her mother, still holding Layla close, looked over at Tom as well, her own face wet with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. I thought I'd lost her forever. I didn't know if I'd ever see her again." Tom gave a small nod, his own voice thick with emotion. "She's been through a lot, but she's strong. She had the courage to ask for help, and that's what got her here. She's lucky to have a mom who never gave up on her." Her mother's eyes filled with fresh tears as she hugged Layla even closer. Maria stepped forward then, gently guiding the two of them to a nearby bench so they could sit and talk, begin the process of reconnecting in a quiet, comfortable space. Tom watched as Layla's mother brushed her daughter's hair back, looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Jimmy walked up beside Tom, watching the scene with a thoughtful expression. "You don't get to see many moments like that in this job," he murmured. Tom nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "No, you don't. But when you do, it makes all the tough days worth it." Jimmy clapped him on the shoulder, a silent show of camaraderie, then turned to head back to his post. Tom lingered a moment longer, watching Layla and her mother talk, their voices soft and filled with the beginnings of laughter. It was a beautiful sight, a reunion born from resilience and the unbreakable bond of family. After a while, Maria approached Tom, her expression warm. "Sheriff, Layla's mother wanted me to pass on her gratitude. She doesn't have the words to thank you enough." Tom shook his head. "I was just doing my job. Layla did the hard part. She was brave enough to reach out, and that's what got her here." Maria smiled knowingly. "She may have been brave, but it was you who gave her the chance. Not everyone listens the way you did." Tom let her words sink in, and he felt a quiet sense of pride. He hadn't thought much about it at the time, but Maria was right. Listening, watching, acting. It was the small things, the small choices, that had made all the difference. He looked back at Layla and her mother one last time, their faces glowing with joy. As he returned to his office, he knew that this case would stay with him for a long time. Layla's strength, her mother's determination, even the darkness they had overcome. It was a reminder of why he had taken this job in the first place, protecting the vulnerable, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, and never giving up hope. Settling back into his chair, Tom picked up his pen and began to finish his report, a rare smile on his face. Layla's story had come full circle, and he felt certain that, at last, she was safe, loved, and exactly where she belonged.